There is a moment that every culture fears more than plague, more than famine, more than the collapse of its cities and the burning of its libraries. It is not a moment that arrives with trumpets or warnings. It does not announce itself with the drama of revolution or the spectacle of war. It comes quietly, in the space between thoughts, in that fraction of a second when you pause and something shifts behind your eyes. It is the moment when a human being looks at everything they have been told is real. The money, the flags, the borders, the hierarchies, the schedules, the careers, the definitions of success and failure, the entire architecture of meaning that has been constructed around them since the moment they drew their first breath, and they simply stop believing it. This is the dangerous moment. Not dangerous in the way you have been taught to understand danger. Not dangerous like a criminal or a disease or an enemy army. Dangerous in the way that truth is always dangerous to those who have built their kingdoms upon convenient lies. Dangerous because once this moment occurs, once the spell breaks even for an instant, you cannot return to the innocent sleep you enjoyed before. You have seen behind the curtain, and the curtain can never again appear solid. Terence McKenna understood this moment with the clarity of someone who had passed through it many times, who had watched others pass through it, and who had dedicated his life to understanding why culture works so tirelessly to prevent it from ever occurring. He understood that what we call civilization is, at its core, a story, a vast, intricate, self-reinforcing narrative that we are born into and taught to inhabit as though it were the only possible reality. And he understood that this story, for all its apparent solidity, for all its institutions and enforcements and rewards and punishments, is held together by nothing more substantial than collective agreement. The moment enough people stop agreeing, the whole thing dissolves like morning fog. Consider for a moment what it means to be born into a story. You arrive in this world as pure consciousness, as unfiltered awareness, as a being with no preconceptions about what reality is or should be. You have no concept of money or nationality or social class. You do not know that certain behaviors will be rewarded and others punished. You have not yet learned that some questions are encouraged and others forbidden. You are, in those first moments, as close to pure being as a human can be, while still inhabiting a body. And then the story begins. It begins with language, with the names that are placed upon things, with the categories that are drawn around experience. This is a table. This is a chair. This is mother. This is father. These seem like innocent descriptions, mere labels for objects that exist independently of the labels. But they are not innocent at all. They are the first threads of the web. Each word carries with it an entire universe of assumptions, expectations, and boundaries. Each word tells you not just what something is, but what it is not, what it cannot be, what questions you should not ask about it. The naming continues. This is good. This is bad. This is beautiful. This is ugly. This is success. This is failure. This is normal. This is strange. Each judgment is presented not as an opinion, not as one possible interpretation among many, but as an objective fact about the nature of reality. You learn these categories so thoroughly that they become invisible to you. You no longer see them as interpretations. You see them as the world itself. And layered upon the naming comes the larger narrative, the story of who you are and why you exist and what you are supposed to do with the brief flicker of consciousness that is your life. This story varies in its details from culture to culture, from era to era, but its function remains constant everywhere it appears. It exists to answer the questions that would otherwise keep you awake at night, to fill the void that would otherwise terrify you, to give you something to do with your time and your energy so that you do not have to confront the radical uncertainty that lies beneath all human existence. In our particular culture, in this particular historical moment, the story goes something like this. You are a separate individual, a skin-encapsulated ego adrift in a universe that is fundamentally dead, mechanical, and indifferent to your existence. Your consciousness is a byproduct of brain chemistry, an accidental emergence from matter that has no inherent meaning or purpose. The universe operates according to fixed laws that can be discovered through scientific investigation, and everything that exists can ultimately be reduced to the interactions of physical particles. Your task in life is to compete with other separate individuals for resources, status, and security. Success is measured in accumulation of money, of possessions, of achievements, of experiences. Time moves in one direction, from past to future, and when your biological machine wears out, your consciousness will simply cease to exist. There is nothing before birth and nothing after death. This is it. This story is presented as scientific fact, as the enlightened modern understanding that has replaced the primitive superstitions of earlier ages. And here is where the genius of cultural programming reveals itself. By presenting the story as anti-story, as mere description of objective reality, the culture makes it nearly impossible to recognize as a story at all. The fish does not know it swims in water. The modern human does not know they swim in narrative. But there are cracks in the story. There have always been cracks. The story requires constant maintenance, constant repetition, constant reinforcement, precisely because it is not true. If it were simply the way things are, no one would need to tell it to you. No one would need to punish deviations from it. No one would need the vast apparatus of education, media, law, medicine, and social pressure that exists primarily to keep the story in place. The cracks appear in dreams, those nightly excursions into dimensions that the story cannot account for. They appear in psychedelic experiences, those chemically induced ruptures in the fabric of consensus reality. They appear in moments of extreme crisis or extreme joy, when the ordinary filters of perception fall away, and you see, if only for an instant, the raw mystery of existence unmediated by cultural interpretation. They appear in the insights of mystics, poets, artists, and madmen, all those troublesome individuals who have, throughout history, tried to point toward what lies beyond the story, and who have typically been rewarded for their efforts with persecution, marginalization, or medicalization. McKenna spent his life studying these cracks, exploring them, expanding them, and trying to help others find their way through them. He understood that the psychedelic experience, whatever else it might be, is first and foremost an experience of story dissolution. When you ingest psilocybin or DMT, or any of the other boundary-dissolving compounds that nature has so thoughtfully provided, you are not simply altering your brain chemistry. You are removing, temporarily but profoundly, the filters through which you have been taught to see reality. You are seeing, perhaps for the first time since early childhood, without the story. And what you see in those moments is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Terrifying because everything you thought was solid turns out to be fluid. Everything you thought was permanent turns out to be temporary. Everything you thought was separate turns out to be connected. The boundaries that seemed so obvious, between self and other, between mind and matter, between past and future, between life and death, reveal themselves as convenient fictions, useful for navigating the practical business of daily existence, but utterly inadequate as descriptions of what actually is. Exhilarating because, beneath the terror, there is recognition. The dissolution of the story does not leave you in chaos. It returns you to something older, deeper, truer than the story ever was. It returns you to the direct experience of being that was your birthright before the culture got hold of you and began the long process of teaching you to see only what it wanted you to see. This is why psychedelics are so dangerous to the established order. Not because they are toxic, most of them are remarkably safe compared to the legal substances we are encouraged to consume. Not because they lead to violent or antisocial behavior, they typically produce states of peace, wonder, and interconnection. They are dangerous because they reveal that the emperor has no clothes. They show you, with the undeniable authority of direct experience, that the story you have been told all your life is exactly that. A story, a human construction, a cultural artifact, one possible way of organizing perception among an infinite number of possible ways. And once you know this, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived reality, you can never fully return to the innocent participation in the story that characterized your former life. You will play along, perhaps. You will continue to show up for work and pay your taxes and observe the social niceties that make collective existence possible. But you will do so with a certain ironic distance, a certain awareness that these are games you are choosing to play, not absolute necessities demanded by the nature of reality itself. You will have become, in the terminology that McKenna borrowed from shamanic traditions, someone who has seen through the world. This seeing through is what the culture fears most. A population that has seen through the world cannot be controlled by the usual methods. They cannot be motivated by manufactured desires or paralyzed by manufactured fears. They cannot be convinced that their worth depends on their productivity or that their identity depends on their possessions. They have found something inside themselves that the culture cannot give and cannot take away, and this makes them immune to the systems of reward and punishment upon which the entire social order depends. The dangerous moment, then, is not just dangerous for you. It is dangerous for everyone who has a stake in your continued participation in the story. It is dangerous for the institutions that require your compliance, the corporations that require your consumption, the governments that require your obedience, and the fellow humans who require the validation of your agreement to maintain their own belief in the story they are living. When you stop believing, you threaten to reveal the contingency of their belief. You become a walking reminder that everything they take for granted is actually chosen, and that different choices are possible. This is why those who have experienced the dangerous moment often find themselves isolated, misunderstood, even persecuted. They have committed the one unforgivable sin. They have seen through the illusion, and by seeing through it, they have demonstrated that seeing through is possible. They cannot be allowed to speak freely about what they have seen, because their speech might awaken similar seeing in others. They must be dismissed as crazy, drugged, deluded, or dangerous, anything to prevent their testimony from being taken seriously by those who still slumber within the story. But here is the paradox that McKenna understood better than most. The dangerous moment is not just dangerous, it is also necessary. It is the evolutionary imperative of consciousness to continuously transcend its previous limitations, to continuously break through the stories that have become too small to contain its expanding nature. The story we are living now, the story of separation, materialism, and consumption, is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. It has brought us to the brink of ecological catastrophe, psychological epidemic, and spiritual starvation. It cannot continue much longer, and it will not continue much longer. The only question is whether enough of us will pass through the dangerous moment in time to imagine and create a different story, one that is adequate to who we actually are and what we actually know. This is not hopeless idealism. This is not wishful thinking. This is an assessment of the historical situation based on the evidence of human consciousness and its inherent tendency towards self-transcendence. We are the species that has always told itself stories, and we are the species that has always eventually outgrown those stories and told new ones. The dangerous moment is simply the doorway between stories. It feels like death because, in a very real sense, it is death. The death of the worldview you have inhabited, the death of the identity that worldview supported, the death of the future you thought you were living toward. But it is also birth. On the other side of that death lies the possibility of a new story, a new identity, a new relationship with reality itself. And that possibility is not abstract or distant. It is available right now, in this moment, to anyone who is willing to look at the beliefs they have inherited and ask, is this true? Is this necessary? Is this the only way? The moment you ask those questions seriously, you have already begun to step outside the story. The moment you recognize that your reality is at least partially constructed by your beliefs, you have gained leverage over that construction. You are no longer merely a character in someone else's script. You have become, however tentatively, however frighteningly, the author of your own experience. This authorship is what the culture cannot tolerate and cannot prevent. It cannot tolerate it because it undermines the foundations of control. It cannot prevent it because it is inherent in the nature of consciousness itself. Consciousness is not passive. It does not simply receive information from the outside world and process it according to fixed rules. Consciousness is active, creative, and fundamentally free. It can always question, always imagine, always choose differently. This is its gift and its burden, its danger and its glory. McKenna called us to embrace this danger, this glory. He did not promise that the journey would be easy or that the destination would be comfortable. He knew from his own experience that breaking free of the cultural narrative involves real loss, real grief, real disorientation. You are giving up a world, after all, the only world you have known, the world in which all your relationships and achievements and memories have their meaning. That is not a small thing. That is not something to be done lightly or pretended away with spiritual platitudes. But he also knew that staying in a dying story is itself a form of death, slower perhaps, more socially acceptable perhaps, but ultimately more complete because it forecloses the possibility of genuine life. To live within a story that you know is false, to pretend to beliefs you do not hold, to participate in systems you know are destructive, is to gradually extinguish the flame of authentic selfhood that is your most precious possession. It is to become a ghost, a shell, a walking function of the social machine. The choice, then, is not between safety and danger. There is no safety. The choice is between the danger of awakening and the danger of remaining asleep, between the pain of birth and the slow suffocation of the womb. And this choice presents itself not once, but continuously, in every moment, in every situation, in every decision about how to spend your attention and your time and your life energy. Will you reinforce the story, or will you question it? Will you play the role assigned to you, or will you improvise? Will you consume the meanings offered by the culture, or will you generate your own? These are not abstract questions. They have concrete implications for how you live today, this very hour. The dangerous moment is not waiting for you in some future experience. It is available now, in the gap between your thoughts, in the silence beneath your assumptions, in the flicker of recognition that passes through you when you hear words like these, and something in you whispers, "Yes, I have always suspected this. I have always known that the world they showed me was not the whole world. I have always sensed that there was something more." That whisper is the voice of your unlived life. It is the voice of the self you could become if you dared. It is not an illusion or a fantasy. It is the realest thing about you, more real than all the roles you play, and all the masks you wear, and all the stories you tell yourself about who you are and why you are here. And it is calling you, as it has always called you, toward the dangerous moment, the rupture, the break, the holy catastrophe that is the only entrance to genuine freedom. The architecture of the story begins not in language, but in time. Before you learn to name things, before you learn to categorize experience, you were taught something far more fundamental, that reality has a shape, and that shape is linear. You were taught that there is a before and an after, a cause and an effect, a past that determines a present that determines a future. This seems so obvious that questioning it appears absurd. Time flows in one direction. Events follow in sequence. This is simply how things are. But is it? Consider your direct experience, not the interpretation you place upon it, but the raw data of consciousness itself. Where exactly is the past? You have memories, certainly, patterns of neural activation that you interpret as records of earlier events. But those memories exist now, in this present moment. They are not located in some other temporal dimension called the past. They are present experiences that you have learned to categorize as being about something called the past. The past itself, as a location you could visit, or a reality that exists independently of your present remembering, is nowhere to be found. It is a conceptual construction, not a direct experience. And the future, where is that? You have anticipations, projections, plans, again, patterns of present neural activity that you have learned to project forward onto an imaginary landscape called the future. But the future never arrives. When what you anticipated becomes actual, it becomes present, and the anticipated future recedes further ahead, always out of reach, always one step beyond the moment you are actually living. What you have then, what you have always had, what you will ever have, is now. This present moment, this immediate experience, is the only time there is. The past and the future are useful conceptual tools for organizing experience, for making plans and learning from mistakes, but they have no independent existence apart from the present consciousness that imagines them. This insight, common to virtually all contemplative traditions, represents one of the first and most fundamental ruptures in the cultural narrative. The story requires you to believe that you are embedded in a flow of time, moving from a determinate past toward an uncertain future. The direct experience of consciousness reveals that you are always and only here, now, in an eternal present that has no beginning and no end. Why does this matter? It matters because the culture's primary method of control is temporal. You are controlled through your relationship to the past and the future. Through the past, you are given an identity, a personal history, a family history, a national history, a species history. You are taught that you are the product of what came before, that your capacities and limitations are determined by your genes, your upbringing, your traumas, your education, your place in various social categories. The past, you are told, makes you who you are, and because you believe this, you behave accordingly. You live out the patterns that your history seems to dictate. You fulfill the expectations that your background seems to demand. Through the future, you are given motivation. You are taught to defer present satisfaction for future reward. You go to school now so that you can get a job later. You get a job now so that you can retire comfortably eventually. You sacrifice today for a tomorrow that never arrives, because when it arrives, it is no longer tomorrow but today, and today must be sacrificed for yet another tomorrow. This deferral is presented as mature, responsible, adult, but it is actually a method of control, a way of ensuring that you remain forever unfulfilled, forever striving, forever dependent on the structures that promise future satisfaction while demanding present obedience. McKenna saw through this temporal trap with particular clarity. He understood that the experience of time itself is a cultural construction, a learned way of organizing perception that varies significantly across different societies and historical periods. The linear, progressive, empty time of modern Western culture, time as a homogeneous medium through which events move from past to future, is a relatively recent invention, largely associated with the rise of industrial capitalism and its need for synchronized, measured, interchangeable units of labor. Before this, time was experienced differently, as cyclical, as qualitative, as mythic, as filled with meaning and significance that varied from moment to moment. The psychedelic experience often involves a profound disruption of ordinary time perception. Minutes can feel like hours, or hours like minutes. Past, present, and future can collapse into a single overwhelming now. The sequence of events can become scrambled, reversible, or entirely irrelevant. For many people, this temporal disruption is one of the most disturbing aspects of the psychedelic experience. Everything they know about how reality works depends on the assumption that time moves forward in an orderly, predictable fashion. When that assumption is removed, the foundations of their worldview shake. But for McKenna, this temporal disruption was precisely the point. It revealed that ordinary time perception is not a window onto reality, but a filter that determines what we can see and what we cannot. When the filter is removed, other temporal structures become visible, structures that are normally hidden by the dominance of linear time. He became fascinated with what he called novelty, the tendency of the universe to produce ever more complex, ever more organized, ever more surprising configurations of matter and information. He believed that novelty was not merely an occasional deviation from an otherwise predictable cosmos, but the fundamental driving force of existence itself, and that linear time was actually a kind of illusion produced by focusing on the repetitive aspects of reality while ignoring the creative aspects. This insight has radical implications for how we understand the present moment. If time is not a homogeneous medium flowing from past to future, but rather an arena in which genuinely new things are constantly being born, then the present is not merely a thin slice between two larger temporal regions. It is the cutting edge of creation, the place where the radically new enters existence. Every moment is an opportunity for novelty, for breakthrough, for the appearance of something that has never been before. And consciousness, rather than being a passive observer of this process, is an active participant in it, perhaps even its primary agent. When you stop believing the story of linear time, something remarkable happens. You stop experiencing yourself as a product of the past, determined by forces beyond your control, moving toward a future you can only dimly anticipate. You begin to experience yourself as creative presence, as the focal point through which novelty enters the world. The weight of your personal history, all those accumulated traumas and failures and limitations, begins to lighten. Not because the events didn't happen, they did, but because you are no longer compelled to interpret them as determining your present identity. The past becomes what it always was, a collection of memories, available for reference when useful, but having no authority over what you choose to do and be in this moment. And the future, similarly, loses its power over you. You stop living in perpetual preparation for a tomorrow that never comes. You stop sacrificing the richness of present experience for abstract goals and distant rewards. This does not mean you become irresponsible or short-sighted. You can still make plans, still take care of practical necessities, still work toward things you value. But you do so from presence rather than from anxiety, from fullness rather than from lack. You do not need the future to complete you, because you are already complete, right now, in this eternal moment. That is the only time you have. This shift in temporal consciousness is, in many ways, the core of what McKenna was pointing toward. All his discussions of psychedelics, of archaic traditions, of the transformation of culture, ultimately circle back to this fundamental reorientation. The story we have been told keeps us trapped in linear time, running from a past we cannot change toward a future we cannot reach. The truth of direct experience reveals that we are always already free, always already present, always already in contact with the creative ground of existence. But the story does not only manipulate our experience of time, it also manipulates our experience of space, specifically the space that appears to exist between oneself and the world, between subject and object, between the consciousness that perceives and the reality that is perceived. This is perhaps the most fundamental assumption of the modern Western worldview, that there is a clear distinction between the interior world of the mind and the exterior world of matter, and that consciousness is located inside the former, looking out at the latter. This assumption seems so obviously true that it requires a real effort of imagination to see it as an assumption at all. Of course, you are located inside your body, behind your eyes, looking out at a world that exists independently of your looking. Of course, your thoughts and feelings are private, internal, invisible to others who inhabit external bodies of their own. Of course, the chair you sit in, the screen you look at, the air you breathe are made of something fundamentally different from the awareness that registers their existence. This is just how things are. But here, too, direct experience tells a different story. When you actually examine your immediate experience, without adding interpretations learned from the culture, you do not find a clear boundary between inside and outside, between self and world. What you find is an undivided field of awareness in which various qualities appear: colors, sounds, textures, thoughts, emotions, sensations. Some of these qualities you have learned to call external, and others internal. But the learning is precisely the point. The boundary is not given in experience, it is added to experience by interpretation. Consider vision. You have been taught that light enters your eyes, is processed by your brain, and produces an internal representation of an external reality. The tree you see is not really there. What is really there is photons bouncing off physical matter, which cause electrochemical signals in your neurons, which somehow produce the subjective experience of green leaves and brown bark. The tree as you experience it is inside your head. The real tree, the physical tree, the tree as it exists independently of your perception, is something you can never directly access. But notice what has happened here. A direct experience, seeing a tree, has been replaced by a theoretical construct. You do not experience photons, neurons, or electrochemical signals. You experience a tree. The photons and neurons are explanatory concepts, useful for certain purposes, but having no existence in your immediate awareness. And the claim that these theoretical entities are more real than your actual experience of the tree is itself a philosophical position, not a self-evident truth. It is the position of scientific materialism, one possible interpretation of reality among many. The alternative is not to deny that physical processes are involved in perception. Obviously they are. But it is to recognize that the relationship between consciousness and the physical world is far more mysterious than the materialist story acknowledges. It is to hold open the possibility that consciousness is not produced by matter, but is in some sense prior to it, or coextensive with it, or identical with it, at a level deeper than their apparent separation. It is to take seriously the testimony of direct experience, which reveals not a world of dead objects viewed by an isolated subject, but a living field of presence in which the distinction between viewer and viewed is fluid, contextual, and ultimately arbitrary. McKenna was deeply influenced by Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher who challenged the materialist assumption at its root by proposing that experience, not matter, is the fundamental stuff of reality. In Whitehead's vision, even the simplest physical entities, electrons, atoms, molecules, have some rudimentary form of experience, some interior life, some capacity for feeling their environments and responding creatively. The universe is not a collection of inert objects accidentally producing consciousness in certain complex configurations. It is a community of experiencing subjects all the way down, with human consciousness being a particularly complex and intense expression of a principle that is present everywhere. This may sound like mystical speculation, but it is actually a more coherent account of reality than the materialist alternative. Materialism cannot explain how consciousness arises from matter. It simply assumes that it must, because matter is all there is, but it cannot describe the mechanism or even conceive of what such a mechanism could look like. This is the hard problem of consciousness that haunts contemporary philosophy of mind, the problem of why there is something it is like to be conscious, why experience has qualitative character, why the physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective feelings rather than occurring in the dark. Whitehead dissolves this problem by refusing to start with dead matter and trying to derive life from it. He starts with experience, with feeling, with creativity, and shows how the objective, material world can be understood as an abstraction from this more fundamental experiential reality. And McKenna, following Whitehead and other process philosophers, saw in this vision a key to understanding what the psychedelic experience reveals. When the ordinary filters of perception are removed, you see a world that is not dead but alive, not separate from you, but continuous with you, not indifferent to your presence, but responsive to it in ways that the materialist story cannot comprehend. This is dangerous knowledge. Not dangerous because it is false, it may well be true, but dangerous because it undermines the story upon which the social order depends. That story requires you to believe that the world is essentially mechanical, essentially dead, essentially separate from consciousness, and therefore available for unlimited exploitation. It requires you to believe that nature is a resource, that matter is inert, that value is something humans project onto an inherently valueless universe. These beliefs justify the treatment of the natural world as raw material for human purposes. They justify the treatment of other beings as objects rather than subjects. They justify the entire economic and political system that is currently driving life on Earth toward catastrophe. If you stop believing this story, if you begin to experience the world as alive and aware and responsive, your relationship to everything changes. You can no longer treat a forest as mere lumber, a river as mere hydroelectric potential, an animal as mere protein. You cannot consume without consideration, develop without reverence, profit without responsibility. You are forced to recognize that your actions have consequences not just for human utility, but for the intrinsic value of beings who have their own experiences, their own interests, their own right to exist. This recognition is what the culture suppresses most violently. It is the recognition that indigenous peoples lived with for millennia before being conquered by civilizations built on the denial of aliveness. It is the recognition that shamanic traditions preserved in their rituals and their plant medicines and their oral teachings. It is the recognition that returns, unbidden and overwhelming, whenever someone breaks through the membrane of cultural conditioning and sees for a moment the world as it actually is. Not a collection of resources to be used, but a communion of subjects to be known. The dangerous moment, then, is not just a shift in belief, but a shift in perception. It is not just a different way of thinking about the world, but a different way of experiencing it. And this shift cannot be contained within the boundaries of private spirituality or personal growth. It has implications, immediate and unavoidable, for how we live, how we organize our societies, how we relate to the other beings with whom we share this planet. To see the world as alive is to accept responsibility for what we do to it. To experience consciousness as fundamental is to recognize kinship with all conscious beings. To understand time as creative presence rather than linear progression is to recognize that the future is not determined, that different choices are possible, that what we do now matters in ways we cannot fully comprehend. McKenna understood that these implications were revolutionary in the deepest sense. Not revolutionary like a political program that seeks to replace one set of rulers with another while leaving the basic structures intact. Revolutionary like a transformation of consciousness that dissolves the foundations upon which all domination rests. The dangerous moment is dangerous precisely because it contains within it the seed of a different world, a world in which the current arrangements of power and privilege and exploitation could not sustain themselves, because no one would believe the story that makes them seem necessary. The story we have been told is not maintained by argument. If it were, it would have collapsed long ago under the weight of its contradictions. The story is maintained by immersion, by the continuous, all-encompassing presence of its assumptions in every aspect of daily life. From the moment you wake until the moment you sleep, you are surrounded by the story's artifacts, speaking its language, moving through spaces designed according to its logic, interacting with people who have also been shaped by it. The story does not need to prove itself because you cannot get outside of it long enough to evaluate it. You are swimming in it. You are breathing it. You are, in a very real sense, made of it. Consider the physical environment of modern life. The buildings, the streets, the vehicles, the infrastructure, all of it embodies specific assumptions about what human beings need and how they should relate to each other and to the natural world. The built environment is not neutral. It is a three-dimensional materialization of the cultural narrative, constantly teaching you its lessons, without ever announcing itself as teaching. The cubicle teaches you that you are an interchangeable unit of productivity. The highway teaches you that speed and efficiency are paramount values. The supermarket teaches you that nature is a factory producing commodities for your consumption. The screen teaches you that reality is something to be watched rather than participated in. You do not have to consciously believe the lessons. Simply by living within the environment, by adapting your body and your behavior to its requirements, you internalize its worldview at a level far deeper than conscious belief. This is what the philosopher Michel Foucault called discipline, the way that physical arrangements and daily practices shape subjects who will reproduce the system without needing to be coerced. The power of the story lies not in its persuasiveness, but in its architecture. You comply not because you are convinced, but because the environment offers you no other options. And then there is language. McKenna returned again and again to language as the primary technology of cultural construction. Language is not merely a tool for describing a pre-existing reality. Language creates reality, or rather, language creates the particular reality that will be shared by a community of speakers. The words you have available determine what you can think. The grammar you have learned determines how you can relate concepts to each other. The metaphors embedded in your language shape your entire understanding of what is possible. English, like most Indo-European languages, structures reality in terms of nouns and verbs. subjects who act upon objects, agents who do things to patients. This grammatical structure embeds the assumption of separation at the deepest level of thought. To speak English is to assume that the world consists of discrete entities that exist independently and then enter into relationships with each other. The alternative, that reality, is fundamentally relational, that entities are constituted by their relationships rather than existing prior to them, is almost impossible to articulate in standard English without sounding paradoxical or mystical. Similarly, English treats time as a substance that can be possessed, spent, saved, or wasted. I don't have time. You're wasting my time. Time is money. These expressions are not just figures of speech. They reflect and reinforce a particular understanding of time that serves specific economic and social purposes. When time becomes a commodity, you become a worker whose labor is measured in units of time and exchanged for wages. The experience of time as fullness, as presence, as the medium in which meaning unfolds, is replaced by time as scarcity, as pressure, as something you never have enough of. McKenna was particularly interested in what he called the logos, the living intelligence that he felt he encountered in the psychedelic experience, especially with psilocybin mushrooms. The logos spoke in language, communicated concepts, offered teachings, but in a form of language that was somehow prior to ordinary speech, more direct, more intimate, more clearly connected to meaning than the words we use in everyday life. He speculated that human language might have originated in this kind of direct contact with an other intelligence, and that the domesticated language we speak today is a degraded form of what was once a magical technology of consciousness. Whatever the historical truth of this speculation, it points to something important about the relationship between language and the cultural narrative. The story is not just a set of beliefs that happens to be expressed in language. The story is language, or more precisely, the story is a particular way of using language that forecloses other possibilities. When language is used bureaucratically, instrumentally, without poetry or magic or sacred dimension, it becomes a prison rather than a tool of liberation. It confines thought within boundaries that seem natural simply because we cannot imagine speaking differently. This is why poetry matters. This is why myth matters. This is why indigenous languages and minority languages and dying languages matter, even when they cannot compete economically with dominant tongues. Each language is a way of seeing the world. Each language contains possibilities that other languages lack. When a language dies, a universe dies with it, not just a collection of vocabulary and grammar, but an entire way of being human, an entire set of potentials that will never be actualized. The monoculture of global capitalism seeks to reduce linguistic diversity just as it reduces biological diversity. It seeks a world in which everyone speaks the same commercial language, thinks the same commercial thoughts, desires the same commercial products. This is not conspiracy, but logic, the logic of a system that requires standardization to function efficiently. But the cost of this standardization is immense. We are losing not just words but worlds. We are losing not just dialects but dimensions. We are losing the capacity to think thoughts that the dominant language cannot think, to imagine possibilities that the dominant language cannot imagine. McKenna saw the psychedelic experience as a way of accessing linguistic possibilities that ordinary language conceals. In the depths of the tryptamine trance, he reported encounters with what he called self-transforming machine elves, entities that communicated not through words, but through a kind of visible language, a language of objects that meant themselves, that did not point to meanings, but embodied them. He did not claim to understand what this meant or where these entities came from. He simply reported the experience and invited others to investigate for themselves. The point is not whether the machine elves are real in some metaphysical sense. The point is that the experience reveals language to be a contingent technology rather than a transparent window onto reality. If radically different forms of communication are possible, even if only in altered states, then our ordinary language is not the only way to structure thought. And if our ordinary language embeds the assumptions of the cultural narrative at its very core, then accessing different linguistic possibilities is a way of escaping the story, even if only temporarily. But the story is maintained not only through space and language, but also through institutions, those formal and informal structures that organize collective behavior and enforce compliance with shared norms. The institution of schooling teaches you how to sit still, pay attention, defer to authority, and measure your worth by external evaluations. The institution of work teaches you to exchange your time and energy for money, to accept hierarchy as natural, to define yourself by your productive function. The institution of law teaches you which behaviors are permitted and which forbidden, which interests are protected and which ignored. The institution of medicine teaches you to understand your body as a machine, your suffering as pathology, your healing as the restoration of normal function. Each institution presents itself as necessary, rational, and serving the common good. Each institution has elaborate justifications for its practices, histories that explain its development, experts who defend its methods. And yet, when you step back and look at the institution from outside, you often see something quite different from what the institution claims to be. You see a system that serves particular interests while claiming to serve universal interests. You see a structure that perpetuates itself regardless of whether it actually accomplishes its stated purposes. You see a machine that has long since escaped human control and now controls the humans who nominally operate it. McKenna was scathing about what he called cultural institutions and their role in maintaining the story. He saw education as indoctrination, medicine as control, law as organized violence, and economics as collective hallucination. This was not cynicism, but clarity. The clarity of someone who had seen through the institutional facades to the power dynamics they concealed. He understood that institutions are not created by abstract social forces, but by specific human beings with specific interests, and that those interests are typically not the interests of most of the people the institutions claim to serve. But he also understood that institutions are not simply imposed from above. They are also accepted from below. They work because enough people believe in them, participate in them, reproduce them through their daily actions. The story is not maintained by a small group of conspirators manipulating an innocent population. The story is maintained by everyone who tells it, everyone who acts as if it were true, everyone who raises their children to believe it and punishes those who deviate from it. We are all complicit. We are all, in varying degrees, both prisoners and guards. This is a difficult truth to accept. It is much easier to identify external enemies, the corporations, the governments, the elites, and to imagine that if only they were removed, everything would be different. But McKenna resisted this temptation. He knew that the story is not a thing that can be destroyed, but a process that must be interrupted. It is not enough to change the people in power. The power itself must be questioned. It is not enough to reform the institutions. The need for institutions must be examined. It is not enough to tell a different story. The habit of believing stories must be understood. This is what makes the dangerous moment so dangerous. It is not a moment of opposition, but a moment of withdrawal. It is not fighting the story, but ceasing to participate in it. And this withdrawal, if it becomes widespread, threatens the story at its foundation. The story depends on belief. It depends on participation. It depends on the collective agreement of millions of people to act as if certain things were true. The moment enough people stop agreeing, stop participating, stop acting as if, the story loses its hold. Not because it has been defeated in argument, but because it has been abandoned in practice. This abandonment is already happening, though it is rarely recognized as such. The young people who refuse to enter the workforce, the communities that create alternative economies, the individuals who simplify their lives and reduce their participation in the consumer system, the meditators and psychonauts who spend increasing amounts of time in states of consciousness that the story cannot account for. All of these are forms of withdrawal, forms of the dangerous moment spreading through the population. They are typically dismissed by the culture as laziness, escapism, mental illness, or fringe behavior. But they may actually be the advance guard of a great transformation, the first symptoms of a story that is reaching the end of its usefulness. McKenna believed that we are living through such a transformation. He believed that the story of Western civilization, the story of progress, of conquest, of the domination of nature, was reaching a terminal crisis, and that what came next would be something radically different. He did not know what form the new story would take. He did not claim to have a blueprint or a program. He simply pointed to the signs of breakdown and invited us to pay attention. The signs are everywhere now. The ecological crisis is not just a technical problem requiring technical solutions. It is a crisis of worldview, a revelation that the story of domination is incompatible with the conditions of life on Earth. The mental health epidemic is not just a medical problem requiring better treatments. It is a spiritual emergency, a revelation that the story of isolated competing selves does not meet the deep needs of human beings for connection, meaning, and transcendence. The political paralysis is not just a problem of leadership or institutions. It is a revelation that the stories told by left and right, by conservatives and progressives, no longer correspond to the actual situation we face. The dangerous moment, then, is not just an individual experience. It is a collective threshold. It is the moment when enough people recognize that the story is a story, that different stories are possible, that the future is not determined by the past. We do not know when this threshold will be reached, or what will happen when it is. We only know that we are closer to it than we have ever been, and that each individual who passes through the dangerous moment brings the collective closer to passage as well. This is what McKenna meant when he spoke of the archaic revival, not a return to the past, but a recovery of capacities that the modern story has suppressed. The archaic human was not stupider or more primitive than the modern human. The archaic human had different values, different perceptions, different relationships with the natural world and the invisible dimensions. The archaic human knew things that we have forgotten, practiced arts that we have lost, maintained connections that we have severed. The archaic revival is the recognition that these older ways of being are not inferior but different, and that our survival may depend on recovering what they knew. The psychedelic experience is one doorway into this recovery. It is not the only doorway. There are contemplative practices, artistic practices, ritual practices that can also open the way. But it is a particularly powerful doorway because it works quickly, bypasses the defenses of the acculturated ego, and produces experiences that are impossible to dismiss as merely conceptual or imaginary. When you have seen, you know. You may not understand what you have seen. You may not be able to integrate it into your ordinary life. But you know, with a certainty that no argument can shake, that there is more to reality than the story has told you. And this knowing is the beginning of everything. It is the crack through which the light enters. It is the seed from which a new world can grow. Not because the knowing itself changes anything. Knowing is not enough. But because the knowing creates possibility. Once you know that the story is a story, you can begin to tell a different one. Once you know that your consciousness is not limited to what the culture has shown you, you can begin to explore what else is possible. Once you know that you are not merely a character in someone else's script, you can begin to write your own. There is a peculiar quality to awakening that those who have not experienced it cannot understand, and those who have experienced it cannot adequately convey. It is not like learning a new fact that can be added to your existing collection of facts. It is not like acquiring a new skill that can be practiced and refined. It is more like discovering that you have been wearing colored glasses all your life without knowing it, and suddenly taking them off to see colors you did not know existed. The world itself has not changed, but your capacity to perceive it has transformed so fundamentally that you might as well be on a different planet. This is why accounts of awakening so often sound either nonsensical or banal to those who have not undergone them. The awakened person says things like, "All is one," or "There is no self," or "Time is an illusion," statements that can sound like mystical jargon or empty tautology. And yet the awakened person insists that these statements point to genuine discoveries, to realities that are as obvious and undeniable as the existence of the physical world. The gap between the experience and its expression is unbridgeable. The finger pointing at the moon will never be the moon. McKenna knew this gap intimately. He was one of the most articulate explorers of consciousness in modern history, a man who could speak for hours about the psychedelic experience with an eloquence that few could match. And yet he repeatedly acknowledged that his words were inadequate, that the experience itself was always more than anything he could say about it, that the best he could hope for was to inspire others to investigate for themselves rather than to take his word for anything. This humility was not false modesty. It was recognition of a fundamental epistemological situation. The deepest truths cannot be transmitted through language, because language is itself a product of the ordinary state of consciousness that these truths transcend. To understand what McKenna was pointing to, you have to go where he went. You have to take the journey yourself. There is no shortcut, no second-hand knowledge, no way to outsource the work of transformation. And the work is difficult, not because the experience itself is necessarily painful, though it can be, but because what the experience reveals cannot be easily integrated into ordinary life. The dangerous moment does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the context of a life that has been structured around the story, with relationships, responsibilities, identities, and commitments that all depend on the story being true. When the story is revealed as illusion, everything built upon it becomes questionable. Consider what it means to realize that your identity is a fiction. Not that you do not exist, but that the person you have taken yourself to be, with a particular name, history, personality, set of preferences and aversions, is a construct rather than a given. This construct was not your creation. It was assembled by the culture, using parts that were lying around, according to templates that served the culture's purposes. You did not choose your name, or your language, or your nationality, or the basic beliefs about reality that shape your perception. These were given to you before you had the capacity to choose, and they have shaped everything that followed. The realization of this does not mean you can simply shed your identity like a snake shedding skin. The construct is too deeply woven into your psyche, too fundamentally integrated with your neural pathways and emotional patterns, to be discarded through an act of will. What changes is not the construct, but your relationship to it. You begin to see it as a role you play rather than a self you are. You begin to hold it more lightly, to invest it with less ultimate significance, to recognize that it could have been otherwise and could become otherwise if circumstances demanded. This shift in relationship to identity is profoundly disorienting. It feels like dying because, in a sense, it is dying. The ego, the structure that organizes experience around a central reference point called me, does not want to be seen through. It will fight to maintain its apparent reality, to reassert itself against the insights that threaten it. This is why so many people who have glimpsed the truth in psychedelic experiences or contemplative states find themselves back in the old patterns shortly afterward. The glimpse is not enough. The insight must be integrated, lived, allowed to transform not just moments of peak experience, but the entire structure of daily life. McKenna spoke of the psychedelic experience as a rehearsal for death. Not death as ending, but death as transformation, as the dissolution of one configuration of consciousness and the emergence of another. The terror that often accompanies the peak of a strong psychedelic journey is the terror of ego dissolution, the sense that everything you know about yourself is being stripped away, that you are falling into an abyss from which there is no return. And the breakthrough that follows, when the terror is passed through rather than resisted, is the discovery that you are still here, that awareness continues even when the familiar structures of identity have temporarily collapsed. This discovery has implications that extend far beyond the psychedelic context. If awareness can continue without the familiar structures of identity, then awareness is not identical with those structures. There is something deeper, something more fundamental, that remains when the surface constructs dissolve. Different traditions have different names for this something: Buddha nature, Atman, the true self, the ground of being. McKenna was eclectic in his terminology, drawing on whatever tradition seemed useful for communicating what he had experienced. But the underlying point was consistent. You are not who you think you are. The identity you have been given by the culture is a temporary configuration, a passing pattern in a much larger process. Recognizing this is not losing yourself. It is finding yourself for the first time. The recognition has a paradoxical quality. On one hand, it is the most intimate possible knowledge of what you truly are beneath all the layers of conditioning. On the other hand, it reveals that the you who has this knowledge is not what you thought it was. The knower and the known collapse into each other. The subject that was supposedly looking at objects turns out to be one with the objects it was looking at. The sense of separation that seemed so obvious, the foundation of all your anxiety, all your striving, all your fear, is revealed as a kind of optical illusion, a mistake produced by the peculiar structure of ego consciousness. This revelation does not solve all your problems. You still have a body that needs food and shelter. You still have relationships that make demands on you. You still have to navigate a world that operates according to the story, even if you no longer fully believe it. The awakened person does not float above earthly concerns. The awakened person walks on the same ground as everyone else, gets sick, grows old, dies. What changes is not the content of life, but the context, the understanding from which life is lived, the background against which everything happens. McKenna was wary of spiritual traditions that promised escape from ordinary existence. He saw the desire for escape as itself a product of the cultural narrative, the assumption that there is something wrong with material reality, that spirit and matter are opposed, that enlightenment means transcending the body and its limitations. He preferred what he called the felt presence of immediate experience, the direct encounter with whatever is happening right now, without filters, without interpretation, without the longing to be somewhere else. This preference shaped his approach to psychedelics. He was not interested in psychedelics as a way of having pleasant experiences or escaping from difficult ones. He was interested in psychedelics as a way of encountering reality directly, of dissolving the barriers between consciousness and its object, of discovering what is actually the case when the cultural filters are removed. And what is actually the case is not escape from the world, but deeper engagement with it. An intimacy with experience that ordinary consciousness, locked in its defensive structures, cannot achieve. The dangerous moment, from this perspective, is not dangerous because it takes you out of reality. It is dangerous because it puts you more fully into reality than you have ever been before. The danger is not unreality, but hyperreality, the overwhelming vividness of experience when the usual buffers and mediations are removed. Most people cannot handle this intensity. They retreat back into the familiar structures, grateful for the protection they provide, unwilling to pay the price of continued openness. But those who can handle it, those who are willing to stay with the intensity and let it transform them, discover something remarkable. They discover that reality itself is far more interesting, more beautiful, more meaningful than anything the cultural narrative has prepared them for. The world seen through awakened eyes is not the grey, mechanical, meaningless world of materialism. It is a world saturated with significance, alive with presence, constantly surprising in its creativity and its generosity. This is what the great mystics of all traditions have testified to. This is what the visionary artists have tried to convey. This is what the poets have stammered toward with their inadequate words. There is a dimension of experience, available to everyone, built into the structure of consciousness itself, that is infinitely richer than normal waking awareness. The story we have been told confines us to a small room in a vast mansion. The dangerous moment is the opening of the door. McKenna understood that the opening of this door has collective as well as individual dimensions. He believed that human consciousness is approaching a threshold, a phase transition, that will transform not just isolated individuals, but the entire species. He called this threshold various things: the transcendental object at the end of time, the eschaton, the attractor at the end of history. Whatever the terminology, the basic idea was that the accumulation of novelty, complexity, and consciousness was building toward a moment of breakthrough, after which everything would be different. This may sound like apocalyptic fantasy, and McKenna was aware of how easily his ideas could be dismissed as such. But he was not predicting the end of the world in any conventional sense. He was pointing to a transformation of consciousness that would change our relationship to the world so fundamentally that we would, in effect, be living in a different world. The transformation would not come from outside, not from alien contact or divine intervention or technological singularity, though it might include elements of all of these. It would come from within, from the awakening of capacities that have always been present but dormant in human consciousness. The signs of this awakening are visible to anyone who knows how to look. The interest in psychedelics is not merely recreational. It reflects a collective hunger for experiences that go beyond the impoverished menu offered by the culture. The interest in meditation, yoga, and other contemplative practices reflects the same hunger. The interest in shamanism, in indigenous traditions, in alternative healing modalities, reflects a growing recognition that the Western medical model, for all its achievements, leaves out dimensions of human experience that cannot be safely ignored. Even the pathologies of our time, the addiction, the depression, the anxiety, the political extremism, the conspiracy thinking, can be understood as distorted expressions of the same underlying impulse. People sense that something is wrong. They feel that they are living in a world that does not make sense, that does not meet their deepest needs, that is heading toward catastrophe. They are reaching for explanations, solutions, alternatives. The explanations they reach for are often inadequate. They blame the wrong causes, propose the wrong solutions, lead to the wrong actions. But the impulse behind the reaching is valid. Something is wrong, and it is not something that can be fixed by minor adjustments to the existing system. What is wrong, McKenna would say, is the story itself. The story of separation, of domination, of endless growth, of matter without mind, of life without meaning. This story has produced wonders, technology that would seem like magic to our ancestors, knowledge that has penetrated the secrets of atoms and galaxies, material abundance that previous generations could not imagine. But the story has also produced horrors, ecological devastation, nuclear weapons, factory farms, surveillance states, a spiritual emptiness that no amount of consumption can fill. We are at a crossroads. We can continue the story until it reaches its logical conclusion: a planet depleted, a species traumatized, a future foreclosed. Or we can tell a different story, a story that recognizes our interdependence with all life, our embeddedness in the cosmos, our responsibility to the future. The dangerous moment is the doorway between these two stories. It is the point at which the old story loses its grip and the new story becomes possible. The choice is not just about beliefs or ideas. It is about how we live, what we value, how we relate to each other and to the earth. It is about whether we continue to treat consciousness as an accident and the natural world as a resource, or whether we begin to recognize consciousness as fundamental and the natural world as sacred. It is about whether we remain prisoners of history or become creators of a future that has not yet been imagined. McKenna did not claim to know how this choice will be made or what the outcome will be. He was not a prophet with a direct line to the future. He was an explorer, a scout, a reporter from the edges of consciousness who returned with news of what he found. His news was both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because it revealed the constructed nature of everything we take for granted. Exhilarating because it revealed the boundless creativity that lies beneath the constructions. The dangerous moment is available now. It has always been available. It will always be available. It requires no special equipment, no expert guidance, no external permission. It requires only the willingness to look at your beliefs and ask whether they are true, to feel your feelings and ask what they are telling you, to pay attention to your experience and ask what you are actually experiencing, rather than what you have been told you should experience. The question is not whether the dangerous moment will come. The question is whether you are ready to enter it. There is a tendency among those who have glimpsed something beyond the story to want to fix it, to articulate it clearly, to turn it into a new doctrine that can replace the old one. This tendency is understandable but dangerous. The insight that dissolves one prison can easily become the blueprint for another. The finger pointing at the moon can become an object of worship, distracting attention from what it was meant to indicate. The liberating realization can calcify into the liberating ideology, and ideologies, however well-intentioned, are precisely what we are trying to escape. McKenna was aware of this danger and tried to guard against it. He refused to start a movement, to establish an organization, to write a definitive text that followers could treat as scripture. He presented his ideas tentatively, provisionally, always with the caveat that they might be wrong and should be tested against personal experience rather than accepted on authority. He encouraged disagreement, welcomed alternative interpretations, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable when people treated him as a guru rather than a fellow explorer. This anti-authoritarian stance was not merely temperamental. It was based on a deep understanding of how the dangerous moment works. The dangerous moment is not the arrival at a new certainty. It is the release of certainty altogether. It is the recognition that the mind's craving for fixed truths is itself part of the problem, that the demand for stable answers is what keeps you imprisoned in stories, that the willingness to live with uncertainty is the price of genuine freedom. This does not mean abandoning all beliefs or taking refuge in an empty relativism where nothing is true and everything is permitted. It means holding beliefs differently, as working hypotheses rather than revealed truths, as tools to be used when useful and set aside when not, as maps that are not the territory they represent. The map-territory distinction is crucial. All beliefs, all concepts, all theories are maps. They are representations of reality, not reality itself. Confusing the map with the territory is the fundamental error that keeps us trapped. The story we have been told is a very elaborate, very detailed map. It tells us what exists and what does not exist, what is possible and what is impossible, what should be valued and what should be avoided. It is so comprehensive, so consistent, so constantly reinforced, that we forget it is a map at all. We take it for the territory. We treat its features as the features of reality itself. And when someone comes along and points out that it is just a map, that other maps are possible, that the territory might look very different from a different perspective, we react with incomprehension, hostility, or fear. The dangerous moment is the moment when you recognize that you are looking at a map, not a territory. In that moment, the map loses its absolute authority. You can still use it. Maps are useful, but you no longer mistake it for reality. You begin to notice its distortions, its omissions, its arbitrary choices. You begin to wonder what the territory would look like if you approached it without any map at all, or with a different map, or with the understanding that all maps are provisional and that the territory is ultimately unmappable. This recognition does not invalidate science, which is our most sophisticated method for making and testing maps. It contextualizes science. It reveals that even the best scientific map is still a map, an abstract representation of selected features of experience, not a complete account of what is. The scientific map leaves out everything that cannot be quantified, everything that cannot be measured, everything that does not fit its methodological assumptions. This is not a failure of science, but its strength. The rigor of its methods depends on limiting its scope. The problem arises only when we forget the limitation, when we assume that what science measures is all there is, when we treat the map as not merely useful, but exhaustive. McKenna was not anti-science. He was deeply interested in scientific developments, especially in complexity theory, chaos mathematics, and the emerging understanding of self-organizing systems. He saw these as pointing toward a new scientific worldview that might be more compatible with the insights of psychedelic and mystical experience than the old mechanistic paradigm. But he was also clear that science, by itself, cannot answer the questions that matter most, questions of meaning, purpose, value, and the nature of consciousness itself. For these questions, we need other methods, other sources of insight, other ways of knowing. The psychedelic experience provides one such way of knowing, not a replacement for science, but a complement to it, a method for exploring dimensions of reality that science cannot access with its current methods. McKenna described the psychedelic state as a kind of empiricism of the impossible, a direct encounter with phenomena that the scientific worldview declares cannot exist. When you experience entities that communicate with you, dimensions that interpenetrate ordinary space, time that folds and warps and reveals structure beyond linear sequence, you are not hallucinating in the simple sense of seeing things that are not there. You are seeing things that are there, but that the ordinary state of consciousness, calibrated to the frequencies of survival and social function, cannot detect. This claim is, of course, controversial. The materialist will say that the entities and dimensions of the psychedelic state are products of altered brain chemistry, patterns generated by neurons firing in unusual ways, no more real than the images of a dream. McKenna was familiar with this argument and did not find it convincing, not because he had a better theory of what the entities and dimensions are, but because he recognized that the materialist argument assumes precisely what it claims to prove. It assumes that brain chemistry is the cause of consciousness rather than its instrument. It assumes that whatever cannot be reduced to physical processes must be unreal. These are philosophical assumptions, not scientific conclusions, and they beg the question against any evidence that might challenge them. The honest response to the psychedelic experience is not certainty in either direction, but wonder, the recognition that we do not know what consciousness is, or what reality is, or what the relationship between them might be. We have theories, maps, models, but the territory remains mysterious. And the psychedelic experience, whatever else it reveals at minimum that the territory is stranger than any of our maps have suggested. This humility before the mystery is not a popular stance in a culture that prizes certainty and control. The story we have been told is a story of mastery, of nature mastered by technology, of disease mastered by medicine, of the universe mastered by science, of the self mastered by psychology. Uncertainty is interpreted as failure, mystery as problem yet unsolved, not knowing as weakness. The pressure to have answers, to project confidence, to never admit doubt, is immense. And the psychedelic experience, with its revelation of radical uncertainty, goes against every instinct the culture has cultivated. But it is precisely this uncertainty that opens the way to genuine creativity. If you already know what is real and what is possible, you cannot discover anything genuinely new. You can only rearrange the elements you already have, producing variations on familiar themes. If you are willing to not know, if you can tolerate the vertigo of groundlessness, the anxiety of open questions, the humility of admitted ignorance, you become available to what you could not have predicted. You become capable of being surprised, of being transformed, of being led somewhere you did not intend to go. McKenna spoke of novelty as the engine of evolution, not just biological evolution, but cosmic evolution, the process by which the universe generates ever more complex, ever more organized, ever more surprising configurations. From the Big Bang to the formation of galaxies, to the emergence of life, to the development of consciousness, to whatever comes next, the trend is toward novelty, toward the unprecedented, toward the genuinely new. And human consciousness, with its capacity for imagination and creativity, is the current leading edge of this cosmic process. But novelty cannot be programmed. It cannot be predicted or controlled. It emerges from the unknown, from the spaces between what we already know, from the cracks in the story. The dangerous moment is dangerous precisely because it opens these cracks, allows the unknown to enter, disrupts the closed system of the cultural narrative. The culture fears novelty because novelty threatens stability. The culture rewards conformity because conformity ensures predictability. The entire machinery of social control is designed to suppress novelty, to channel creativity into safe forms, to prevent the emergence of anything that might upset the established order. And yet novelty continues to emerge. It emerges in art that violates conventions and opens new perceptual possibilities. It emerges in science that discovers phenomena the old theories cannot explain. It emerges in social movements that demand recognition for perspectives the dominant story excludes. It emerges in individuals who, for whatever reason, cannot fit themselves into the boxes the culture provides. The universe is creative. Life is creative. Consciousness is creative. No system of control, however sophisticated, can finally suppress the creative impulse. The question is whether we will participate consciously in this creativity or be carried along unconsciously by forces we do not understand. The dangerous moment offers the possibility of conscious participation. By releasing us from the automatic functioning of cultural programming, it gives us access to the creative ground from which all programs emerge. We can become, in a sense, co-creators rather than merely creatures, active participants in the ongoing evolution of consciousness rather than passive products of processes we did not choose. This is not a promise of omnipotence. We cannot create reality simply by wishing it so. We are embedded in networks of causation, subject to conditions we did not create, limited by circumstances beyond our control. But within these limits, there is room for genuine choice. There is room for the kind of freedom that consists not in escaping conditions, but in responding to them creatively. There is room for what McKenna called the imagination, not as fantasy or escape, but as the capacity to envision what does not yet exist and to work toward bringing it into being. The imagination, in this sense, is the most radical faculty humans possess. It is what allows us to see beyond the immediate, to conceive alternatives, to hold possibilities that have no current existence. Without imagination, we would be entirely determined by our circumstances, reacting automatically to stimuli without the capacity to evaluate or redirect our reactions. With imagination, we can step back from our circumstances, consider them, and ask whether they might be otherwise. The cultural narrative suppresses imagination by filling the space of possibility with its own content. It tells you what to imagine, what to dream, what to hope for, what to fear. It provides ready-made futures, the good life as defined by advertising, the career trajectory as defined by corporate culture, the relationship templates as defined by romantic comedy. These ready-made futures occupy the imaginative space that might otherwise be available for genuine creativity. They channel your energy toward goals that serve the system, leaving little left over for goals that might transform it. The dangerous moment clears this space. By revealing the ready-made futures as constructions rather than necessities, it frees imagination for other purposes. What do you actually want? Not what you have been told to want, not what everyone else seems to want, not what would be sensible or practical or approved, but what you actually, deeply, truly want. This question, asked seriously, opens abysses. It reveals that much of what you have been pursuing has been pursuit of borrowed desires, scripts written by others, goals that have nothing to do with your authentic nature. McKenna encouraged people to trust their imagination, to take their visions seriously, to treat the contents of psychedelic and dream and creative states as meaningful rather than dismissing them as noise. This was not naive credulity. He did not suggest that every vision was literally true or that imagination was a reliable guide to fact. But he recognized that imagination is our connection to possibilities beyond the actual, and that devaluing it cuts us off from the very faculty we need for transformation. The dangerous moment is thus also a creative moment. It is the moment when the old story loses its grip and new stories become possible. The space that opens when certainty dissolves is not just void, it is also potential. It is the potential for something genuinely new, something that has never been before, something that could not be predicted from what came before. Whether this potential is actualized depends on what you do with the moment. You can retreat back into the old story, grateful for its familiarity, unwilling to face the anxiety of the open. Or you can stay in the opening, tolerate the uncertainty, and begin to imagine what might come next. What comes next is not written anywhere. It is not predetermined by historical laws or divine plans, or the blind mechanics of causality. It is genuinely open, genuinely undetermined, genuinely waiting to be created by the choices of conscious beings like yourself. This openness is terrifying to the part of you that wants security, that wants to know what will happen, that wants guarantees. But it is exhilarating to the part of you that is creative, that is free, that knows that without openness, there can be no novelty, no growth, no meaning. McKenna lived in this openness with remarkable courage. He did not pretend to have final answers. He did not offer certainty to those who sought it from him. He pointed toward the unknown and said, "Go there, see for yourself, find out what is true through your own experience." His legacy is not a doctrine, but an invitation to take the dangerous moments seriously, to trust consciousness more than culture, to believe that genuine transformation is possible. This invitation is more urgent now than when McKenna was alive. The systems he criticized have become more entrenched, more pervasive, more destructive. The ecological crisis has accelerated. The mental health epidemic has worsened. The political polarization has intensified. The technological development has proceeded without the wisdom to guide it. We are careening towards something, a transformation or a catastrophe, perhaps both. And the story that has brought us to this point has no resources for navigating what lies ahead. The resources we need are within us. They have always been within us. The capacity for direct knowing that bypasses cultural filters. The creativity that can imagine what has never been. The courage that can face the unknown without retreating into the familiar. The love that recognizes kinship with all beings. The wonder that finds the universe infinitely more than any map can represent. These capacities are not achievements to be earned, but birthrights to be claimed. They are what you are, beneath the layers of conditioning that have taught you to be something less. Claiming these birthrights is not easy. The conditioning runs deep. The story reasserts itself at every moment, offering its familiar comforts, punishing its deviations. You will be tempted, again and again, to fall back into the dream, to pretend that you never woke up, to trade your freedom for the safety of the known. This is not a failure of character, but a feature of the situation. The dangerous moment is not a once-for-all breakthrough, but an ongoing choice that must be made and remade continuously. And you will not make this choice in isolation. The dangerous moment is individual. No one can pass through it for you, but its consequences are collective. As you change, the field of possibility around you changes. As you tell a different story, others become capable of hearing it. As you live from a different place, you create spaces where others can find their way to that place. The transformation of consciousness is not a private affair. It ripples out through all your relationships, all your actions, all the subtle influences you have on the world around you. This is how the story changes. Not through revolution or reform or top-down intervention, but through the accumulation of individual transformations that gradually shift the center of gravity of the collective. Each person who passes through the dangerous moment and refuses to retreat becomes a node of new possibility. Each person who lives as if consciousness matters, as if meaning is real, as if the future is open, contributes to a field that makes these things more accessible to others. We are in this together, even when we feel most alone. Our individual journeys are part of a collective journey that is larger than any of us can comprehend. McKenna sensed that this collective journey was approaching a critical transition. He spoke of the end of history, the eschaton, the attractor at the end of time, metaphors for a transformation so profound that the story we have been living would simply cease to be applicable. Whether this transition happens in our lifetimes or in some future generation, whether it takes the form he imagined or some other form entirely, the intuition behind it seems sound. The story cannot continue indefinitely. Something must give. Either we transform or we perish. These may be the only options left. The dangerous moment is the doorway to transformation. It is the point at which the old pattern dissolves and a new pattern becomes possible. Individually, it is the death and rebirth of the self. Collectively, it is the death and rebirth of the culture. The process is painful because death is painful, even the death of illusions, even the death of prisons. But the process is also liberating because birth is liberating. The emergence of something new, something undetermined, something that has never existed before. You are standing at this doorway now. You have been standing at it your whole life, though perhaps without knowing it. The invitation is always open. The moment is always available. Nothing is required but the willingness to look, to question, to feel. to release what no longer serves, to open to what wants to emerge. The culture tells you this is dangerous, and it is right. It is dangerous to everything the culture has built, but it is life to everything that the culture has suppressed. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. The dangerous moment when you stop believing the story is not a moment imposed from outside. It is a moment of recognition, of claiming what you have always known, of becoming who you have always been. The story is a story. You are not bound by it. Another world is possible, not in some distant future, but right now, in this present moment, in the quality of your attention, in the direction of your intention, in the courage of your imagination. McKenna's life was a testament to what becomes possible when someone trusts consciousness more than culture, when someone is willing to go where the evidence of direct experience leads, when someone refuses to let fear determine the boundaries of inquiry. He did not find all the answers. He would have been the first to admit his limitations, his mistakes, the provisional nature of everything he claimed. But he pointed towards something real, something important, something that the culture works overtime to conceal. He pointed toward freedom. Not freedom as the culture defines it, the freedom to choose among options the culture provides, but genuine freedom, the freedom to question the options themselves, to imagine new options, to participate consciously in the creation of reality. This freedom is dangerous. It undermines everything stable and predictable about the social order. It introduces chaos into systems that require control to function. It makes people ungovernable by the usual methods of reward and punishment. And it is this freedom that calls to you now, in whatever circumstances you find yourself, whatever stories you have been told, whatever identity you have been given. The dangerous moment is available. The doorway is open. What lies beyond it cannot be described in advance because it has not yet been created. It will be created by those who pass through, by the choices they make, by the worlds they imagine into being. This is not the end of the exploration, but the beginning. It is not the arrival at a destination, but the departure on a journey. The journey has no predetermined end because the end is created by the traveling. We are all making it up as we go along, though some of us know this and some do not. Those who know have an opportunity and a responsibility to participate consciously in the making, to bring intelligence and compassion and creativity to a process that will happen whether we participate or not. The cultural narrative is dissolving. The old maps are failing. The future is genuinely uncertain. These are facts, not interpretations. What we do with these facts is up to us. We can cling to the old story, pretending that it still works, hoping that someone will fix things, waiting for instructions that will never come. Or we can accept the invitation that the moment offers, the invitation to wake up, to grow up, to show up, to bring whatever gifts we have to the collective work of transformation. The dangerous moment awaits. It has been waiting all along. It will wait no longer than it needs to, because the time for waiting is running out. Not because of any cosmic deadline, but because the consequences of the old story are becoming unbearable, because the suffering produced by our sleep is reaching proportions that cannot be ignored, because the earth itself is signaling that the path we are on leads nowhere good. Listen to that signal. Feel it in your body, in your heart, in the depths of your being. Something is wrong, and something is possible. The wrongness is the death throes of a story that has run its course. The possibility is the birth of a story we have not yet told. Between the death and the birth is the dangerous moment, the gap, the opening, the chance. Take it. Not because McKenna said so or anyone else says so, but because you know, in that part of you that has never fully believed the story, that this is why you are here. This is what you came for. This is what your life is about. Not the accumulation of achievements or possessions or experiences, but the transformation of consciousness itself, the awakening from the dream, the return to what you never really left. The story ends. Another begins. The dangerous moment is the hinge. Turn the page. See what is written there. Nothing. Nothing yet. That blank page is your inheritance and your task. Write it well. Write it true. Write it as if everything depended on it, because everything does. The future is counting on you. The past is releasing you. The present is all there is. Begin.